So, hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. So, with me today is a returning guest, and I'm sure many of you will recognise his voice already. So, we've got Clive Webb from the ACCA. Oh, too many C's, ACCA, on the podcast today, here to talk all about sustainability and in M&A. So, welcome, Clive. So great to have you back on the show.
Oh, my pleasure to be here again. Nice to be invited.
And I have to say, for anyone who hasn't checked out the latest research, this one was for me particularly very interesting. And I think just the content around how impactful the sustainability conversation is becoming in that sort of M&A and transaction space is really interesting. So, but before I get really excited about the report and so the first thing I'll say to everyone, you've definitely got to read it. But Clive, give us some of like the highlights. What did you learn during this research?
Okay. I think the first thing to say is, look, sustainability matters. We all know that. But it's how it changes the way businesses need to act in the future. And when we come to transactions, M&A, PE investment, whatever, we're looking medium term, longer term, and the way organizations need to change. Now, it's both a risk and opportunity. That's the first thing to say, because we naturally think it's a risk, but it's also a business opportunity. But there are so many things you need to think about, particularly if you think really what sustainability means, that when you come to invest or when you come to be invested in, because this is also about preparing for investment. If you want loans and banks, they now start increasingly asking these questions. If you want private equity investment, you are going to be in that domain, sure as anything. So it's about thinking about what your strategies are as much as what you need to think about if you're investing in somebody else. So there's always two sides to this equation. And I think it's important people stand back and think, well, actually, are we on the right point in the journey, and where's that journey going to take us? So that's the first thing. Second thing I would say is, look, you need to actually get organized, have the data, have the information, understand that it's not simply about the due diligence part, it's about every single step and stage in the transaction processes. You've seen, Hannah, that in the report, there's a wonderful sort of step ladder, which sort of starts explaining things. When you get in some of the phases, there are up to 10 steps that you need to think about. So think about that from the journey on that side. Finally, think about the skill sets. If you are acquiring an organization, if you are doing the due diligence, have you got the right people advising you? Have you got the right expertise? I mean, the one that a lot of our members latch onto immediately is contaminated land. If land has got somebody used the example of trying to purchase a business that was built on a former petrol station. You don't know what's in the land. You don't know what has contaminated that land over the years. Have you got the cleanup costs of that land going forwards? So there's that sort of side to it. Another example, we've talked about the Me Too movement over the years. Well, Me Too still is very current, but what you're trying to do when you're doing the deal is to understand, well, are there any past events that might cause a future liability? And do we write warranties, and are we going to accept warranties that, if something did happen and the organization gets an action against it, what is the position in that? So it's not even just environmental, it's all sorts of social things as well that add to it. So having the right expertise, having the right people involved, asking the right questions is really what we wanted to encourage people through the report to do.
Yeah, and I can vividly picture that curve of the sort of the transaction cycle, as it were.
Mm,
So talk a little, because obviously a lot of us think about and focus on the due diligence piece. So how do we pass due
mhm.
diligence, right? That is, when you're in that kind of transaction, that's all you're thinking about. But how does sustainability now being incorporated into other parts of that process? What are some of the things that are coming up?
Okay, so let's just step back 1 second and say, well, what do we mean by sustainability? Because that's we all have different notions, and some people will naturally tend towards just thinking about the environmental side. But the environmental side is coupled with, you know, the right social angles. So that can be, employee well-being, living wage, all those sorts of things. Um, and as you move the environmental dial, so you will impact people's prosperity, and that combination is important. So it's about the financial stability, it's about the environment, it's about the people. So sustainability is that, and then around it you've got to have the governance. So when you kick off at the start, you've got to think about where you are in day one. So if you want to go and acquire an organization, what is your current sustainability journey like? Is it going is the act of acquiring somebody going to increase or decrease your own sustainability risk? Is it a risk that you yourself want to take? Um, so it's about thinking about what that appetite is, and then what the balance of your own stakeholders, your shareholders, your investors attitude is likely to be if you start either denuding or enhancing your sustainability journey. So you've got your own position to start with, you've got the implications of your own position. Then you've got to say, well, do I want to start looking for organizations that either improve or worsen? Am I going to cope with the level of integration that I would need to do? What are the risks that I need to look for when I'm starting to think? So even when you do that high level horizon scanning of the organizations that you can buy or the organizations you invest in, you've got to start thinking about the impact on your own journey. And that comes back, to the acquisition strategy. And one of the points we make in the report is, a lot of the investment committees that sit behind these things themselves aren't yet sufficiently savvy to ask the right questions. So it's inherent on people to sit back and think, well, what are the right questions to ask in that journey? So it basically starts at the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think that was interesting. And I guess how, if we think about, as people are going into that sort of investment and acquisition cycle, maybe they're looking for investment. How
Hmm.
impactful is sustainability? You talked about those three, always these three elements of
Hmm.
sustainability, but how impactful is that in terms of the number of investors that are available to talk to, but also
Okay.
like from a valuation perspective as well?
Oh, right. Two difficult topics. Right. Um, so for the range of investors, obviously one of the things is that each investor, as I just said in terms of your own position, but each investor has their own journey. And one of the most significant drivers in bringing this up in the agenda is that attitude to the investor. So they are looking to either fund in ethically sound businesses or businesses on a sustainability journey. If they're private equity, you're starting to see regulation coming in the UK and in Europe about, are these funds really green? Are they investing in the right people? Are they the right journey? So they don't want to invest in people who are potentially going to denude their green credentials, for example. Um, so you've got that side of the journey of, well, actually matching the investor community to the organization means that, if you are looking for funding, you need your own journey well articulated, well understood, and the plan set up. One CFO in a mid-tier firm in Wales was all explained, well, there comes this massive packet of questions around sustainability, and I have to fill in all these checklists to be able to access investment. I need the robust plan. So if you're not on that journey, then you run the risk of, actually, as you said, the range of people that you are potentially accessing for capital decreasing. And obviously there are some investors who are willing to take that high risk in their mind, but you're going to pay a premium for it. So this is one of those things. When it comes to valuation, this is another complex thing. Traditionally we've seen valuations be multipliers of future revenue streams. Well, to some extent, you create uncertainties in revenue streams with sustainability. We need to invest trillions globally in sustainability to get ourselves to net zero targets. So that obviously affects the ratio. But equally, from the PE houses side or from the bank side, you want to be able to move the business on. So at the end of 5 years, you get the earn-out. So is there a plan to make that valuation in 5 years' time as critical as the valuation today? Then you've got to value in, well, actually, what are the risks of that sustainability journey? What is the organization? What are regulations likely to be? ... So the valuation piece gets ever more complicated. In the really big picture, the IVSC, so the International Valuation Standards Committee, have just January this year issued a set of guidelines about incorporating the valuation of ESG into that model. There's a similar set for the private equity space as well. So people are starting to think about, well, actually, how does it affect, and can we put some guidance around this? So go and look at their guidance, for example, on, well, actually, how do you bring ESG into the valuation of business? But it is a major impact. You can't ignore it. If you ignore it, it's sort of your own peril on either side, the buy or the sell side.
And I guess it's also about thinking ahead, because one of the challenges is when you're
Mm.
in that funding round or that investment cycle, you're so focused on that, you don't necessarily have the time to go back and almost clean up the and understand your sustainability journey. So it's actually something people need to start thinking about nice and early, because there's quite a bit of analysis that needs to be done to actually assess your own sustainability impact. I was reading some of the things to think about, and they're very in depth within that as well. So how far ahead should people be considering? And have you got any insight on how long it's taking people to get to grips with their sustainability journey?
How far ahead should they be thinking? And I think the answer to that, realistically, is if you're not thinking about that journey today, in whatever state your business is in, whatever point of the cycle, then you run a risk. Now, obviously, what you need to do is think about the impact that it has. And as I said, for every risk, there's an opportunity. So it's not always a negative story. We can write sustainability as just a risk. We have got to see the opportunity side. So if you're not thinking about that journey, why are you not thinking about that journey? That said, as you and I have talked about before, Hannah, it's another domain that hits the CFO, particularly in the mid-tier and the smaller organizations, of, oh, well, this is another thing you've got to think about. And where do you get the expertise to do it? So there is that conundrum. There has to be that conundrum. But because it becomes very much linked to the whole finance piece, then how do you move forward is a real question now. And it sits, I think, firmly, therefore, within the CFO in some form or other. So the answer to your question, I think, is be prepared now, no matter what stage you're in the cycle, because wherever you are, you're going to need to start thinking about it the minute that you get into some form of funding, be that bank lending, be that M&A, be that M&A, be that whatever it may be.
And there are obviously different types of transactions. So PE tend to have a fairly short-term view. It's normally about 5 years, whereas obviously there's more strategic acquisitions
Yeah.
that happen. So how does the perspective on sustainability differ for the two types of, I guess, transactions that you might go
Okay.
into?
I think the longer term one, so this is where we're actually doing the deal. We are merging or integrating or divesting, because there is also a piece of organizations divesting components that might not be as, let's say, robust in their business model for a sustainability point of view 5-10 years down the line. So I think for those organizations where you're doing that kind of deal, it's a question, where is the long-term plan? Can you integrate, let's say we're talking about acquisition, can you integrate the two plans successfully? Are you actually managing to move that forwards? And anything in the purchase space, you talk about the 100-day plan or the post-merger integration plan. Can you get the organization on a level keel in 100 days? And anybody that's ever done anything in that space knows post-merger integration is a nightmare to try and get two different cultures, two different organizations working together. We've always had problems trying to get two finance functions working together, yet alone two sustainability functions. So I think the question for there is, how do you create a longer term vision successfully? And do you think in the acquisition process you can do that? And if you can't, then it's a risk. And this is where you get the 50% of people walking away statistic, which is probably quite realistic now, because people start to see the level of investment required on some businesses going forward. The PE space, I think, is a slightly different question, because what you're thinking about, as I hinted a moment ago, is, well, actually, what is the impact in 5 years? Typically, let's say the PE cycle is 5 years, 7 years, whatever. What is the impact on the valuation and the earnout that the PE house is looking for in 5 years' time? And we know that, or we suspect that in all probability, at the end of that cycle, our emphasis on sustainability will be more than it is today. That's probably a fair assumption, I would say. So it's going to impact the valuation that you are aiming for at the end of the cycle. So again, if you're not thinking about it today, what is the impact on that earnout? And what is the impact on the goal? And for CFOs who are deep PE specialists, and there's a whole cadre of CFOs that really work in that space, how do they measure that risk? And how do they engineer and configure the organization to get you to that point of that earnout goal or exceed it, given that they need to invest in, let's say, reconfiguring part of the business model, or invest in renewable energy, or whatever they need to do to mitigate the risk in their organization.
And you mentioned an
Add to that,
interesting. Oh,
go on, Hannah.
no, add to that.
I was going to say, add to that, we have the emergence of reporting regulation. And, in the UK, the adoption of the ISSB standards. In Europe, you've got CSRD, CS3D coming in. Now, that won't affect all entities, but it does affect, through ripple effects, most entities somehow. 5 years down the line, those assessments are going to be, if not more critical, in terms of the information to provide. So you got to think about how you get that journey as well, if you're talking about your valuation, your exit 5 years down the line.
Yeah, and I guess the PE company want to know that in 5 years' time you're going to be ready to sell, and if they've got a massive piece
Yeah.
of work to do on sustainability, that which is going to be even more important, that's going to devalue the business in 5 years. So
Yeah, and remember as well, it's not just your organization, it's your supply chain,
yeah,
or your supply network, as I'm supposed to say these days. So it's, what is the robustness of your value network and your supply network in delivering the products? So it's not just about you. 5 years time, you got to think about, well, actually, where am I going to source my materials from? Are they on the right journey? Are they ethically, sustainably secure? Are they paying the living wage? ... So you've got a ripple effect in all of this.
Yeah, and I think I was chatting to, weird enough, one of our customers who does a lot of work in this space, and it was fascinating, almost the hidden cost that's sitting in a lot
Mm,
of supply chains, even for businesses that aren't necessarily buying products. You know, that there's a lot of, just who they're buying. Things like, computer equipment from. Where is it going? What
mm,
are they doing with it? It was fascinating. They did a presentation for us. It was so interesting to understand, almost like the potential risk in even the smallest or the perceived smallest supply chain. It was really interesting.
mm. There was a lady I was talking to her a few weeks ago, and she was sort of saying, well, you know, they're in sort of midpoint in a value network. And
Mm,
she said, well, even the realization that my scope one is somebody else's impacting their scope three
yeah,
hasn't dawned on a lot of people.
yeah.
And think 5 years forward, we are probably going to get where that isn't an excuse that most investors will happily be willing to take.
Yeah, and also, depending on the size of your customer base, like the rigor that they are going to have to follow for their reporting purposes could potentially hinder your ability to take on new customers. So that there
Hmm.
is so much in it, I think, at the moment that I find really interesting. But one thing I wanted to dig into is you mentioned some stats there about
Hmm.
50% of transactions
Mm.
are walked away from, if I understood that correctly. Tell me a
Yeah,
little
yeah,
bit
yeah.
more about that.
Well, so that's it. Let's say with caution, that's a US number.
Mm,
Um, so, but what it does tell us is that investors are starting to take this seriously. So, if you're thinking about access to capital, if you're thinking about that M&A process, it shows you that the risk is real and current. And that 50% of people walking away is because, it's either not aligned, as we spoke about earlier on, or there is an unknown risk, maybe to do with environmental cleanup, maybe to do with climate change on the factories, the locations of where services are provided from, or more fundamentally, um, changes the operating model. Think about the impact of this wet winter that we've had here on the whole food cycle. That there are some real changes that we potentially need to think about. So you can see people walking away from deals quite easily because they're not willing to take that risk, and the risk appetite not matching. Remember, when you asked me about the start of this process, that risk appetite, what are you willing to take? You can see why people walk away, because they're not willing to take the risk going forward. So if you're in an industry that is particularly vulnerable for any number of reasons, you know, it's about thinking about the robustness of those plans. If those plans aren't robust enough, people aren't going to invest, or they are going to walk away, or the deal will not conclude because of that mismatch of appetite. So that's why the 50% is real, but actually quite frightening.
and is that 50% specifically for sustainability reasons, or is it
Mm?
across the board? It's like, so, and
No,
is that 50% of the reasons that people walk away, or is it literally, going
I,
into 2
so the
deals,
way the stat,
1 will fail?
the yeah, the way the stat is worded is your second one.
Mm.
So 50% of deals fail because of sustainability reasons.
Wow, that's what an impact.
Yeah.
That's an incredible headline. And what's really interesting is I wonder how many people actually are aware of that in terms of the reasoning. Because there was a really interesting part in the report about how the perception as well is just as important. So if you go into a deal with the glossy brochure about how amazing you are,
Hmm.
all that greenwashing piece, but when the PE company gets in and they start to dig under the hood and they feel it doesn't quite align, that even that can be cause
Hmm.
for like almost like the walkway, the perception of how well you actually meet what you said you were going to do is just as important. If they see any risk, that's the bit that's making them, take a step back.
Mm, yeah, and this comes down to, yeah, that efficacy, that uh, the ethical lens that as a finance professional you need on these issues. It, as you said, it isn't. There's a lot of talk about greenwashing, and as you've seen in the report, there's also a lot of talk about ESG ratings as another dimension to this, and the flaws in that system, and the regulators generally are trying to tidy that up a bit. But it's trying to understand what is the true position, and that truth and that ethical lens is remarkably important. It comes back to why finance professionals are important in the process, because of our ethical lens, and the lens by which we come at this. And it isn't just about the future revenue stream. It's about, what are the risks to your customers, what are the risks to suppliers, what is the activity in the value chain. And it's also assuring people who want to do business with you that you are a sustainable business going forwards. So part of the whole CS3D side of this is, are you a robust business going forwards? And that's, in the four things that we highlighted, that investor supply chain side and also the customer power side are two important factors of why this has to be on a board agenda, on a CFO's agenda, anytime you're doing investment funding, M&A, etc.
And you know what I found really interesting was the fact that it's not a tick box exercise anymore. And I think it has been historically. Like I
Yeah.
think one of the consultants mentioned sitting down in a room and he's got the NPS score for the employees saying how happy they are. And he's like, well, go get 6 employees, let me sit them down in a
Yes.
room and have a conversation, which I thought was
Yeah.
it's just a whole different approach to that sustainability conversation, isn't it? Rather than just being able to
Mm.
serve up the stats, like it sounds like investors are really trying to understand where somebody's truly at in that sustainability journey.
But what are you buying? You're
Mm.
buying people who have an intellectual capability to do something. So you want people who are engaged with the organization, and you don't want them to walk away. So, can you prove your scores, your staff satisfaction scores? Can you prove your net promoter scores? What actually do they mean? The statistics aren't enough if the value of the organization is in the individual. You talked about valuation, and in my days in doing M&A, on the side of M&A, you used to talk about deconstructing the purchase price by various elements, and you always get to this point where part of it we call goodwill. But what is goodwill? It's the intellectual property of the individuals. It's the ability of the organization to move forwards. And what is important for the sustainability side is, are you taking those, is there a business that is feasible going forwards? Are the people employed? Do they have good jobs? And the way I use the term good job is something that rewards you and I both intellectually, um, from a mental health perspective, and also from a financial perspective. So it's a bigger thing than simply the amount you and I are paid. Um, are they engaged and likely to stay, because they are the assets of the organization going forward? As we get more and more into service industries, that's what you're buying. You're buying, yeah, in your business, you're buying the credibility of the people, aren't you?
No,
How do you value
absolutely.
that? How do you value that in sustainability terms?
Mm. And yeah, and I guess it's the fact. What's interesting is how robust those conversations now need to be. And I
Mm,
think it's surprising, I think, reading the report, like how robust these numbers and this depth needs to be. I think that was my biggest takeaway, is that we've moved
mm,
away from surface level ESG to
yeah.
genuine policies, procedures, and is it embedded within the organization? And how can you
Yeah.
demonstrate and show that to us? That was what I found
And
really interesting.
and back to the comment we've made earlier on about the post-merger integration. If you have
Mm.
that long-term combination of businesses, the first thing you've got to do is align the culture, because it's the culture of the organization on that sustainability journey, as it is on other components of culture. And you're right, if the organization does not believe in its long-term future, its sustainability, its commitment to reduce carbon or whatever that may be, if that's not threaded through, then you're going to, you get into another factor why 50% will walk away, because it has no, potentially you're increasing the risk of there not being a long-term future for that business. But proving it is about talking to you and me.
Yeah, and that's it. And
Yeah.
and I think what's interesting is that almost like we're in the early stages of I would say the compliance side, like you say, they're still
Mm.
finding gaps in how they're measuring and how we're reporting on sustainability. But that gap's going to close pretty quickly,
Hmm.
from what I've seen and what I've heard. So actually, like even if you don't have to report at that level, you need to be delivering to that level, because at this,
Hmm.
it's going to come to, even to small and medium sized businesses, it's going to hit. It's not just in the big business anymore.
No. And we have to think, I mean, it's a conversation I think you and I have had before. We have to think about how we measure organizational performance in that holistic way. So, if you're looking at investing in the business, you are saying, well, how integrated are your key performance indicators across all of these elements? If you're not managing one particular element, let's say, I don't know, the working conditions of the workers in your value chain, just to pick something that's slightly obscured. If you are not actively trying to measure or manage that, is that a significant business risk to your operating model going forwards? Is it one of your key performance indicators? And if you are not able to have that robust conversation, then the investor is going to walk away, because you're not going to go, well, actually, we know we are managing the risk. We know dot, dot, dot. And it comes down to that level of sophistication, but it's also across a range of things. So, how are you dealing with biodiversity impacts? How are you dealing with emissions? How are you thinking about the impact of carbon trading, if that's something that impacts the industry you're working in? Where do your governance processes sit to manage those risks? And so you've got to go in the report. There's a wheel, what I might term a wheel, with sort of factors around which we then drill down into literally 10 discussion points across 5 areas, or I think there are 45 discussion points in total. They're just things to think about in any of this element of discussion, but it's fairly wide ranging.
And we mentioned that obviously the 50% of transactions being walked away
Hmm.
from. Were there any other interesting stats like that really either caught your eye or surprised you during this research?
It's actually a field where stats are hard to come by
Mm.
in that sense, because it's not one that you, as a researcher, you can readily go and say, well, you know, what is your perception of A, B, or C? Because that perception is going to be so impacted by the nature of the industry that you're working in. So we didn't do a survey this time. We looked at the principles and we tried to understand from the story side, those narrative stories that we've been talking about, you know, does it mean that you thought about the contaminated soil? Does it mean you thought about the people in the value chain? Does it mean that you've understood all the regulatory risks that you potentially might face? And what you form a picture of is that people need to go on that journey to explore it before you can draw more hard, concrete statistics that say, well, actually, this is the impact. We're not at the start of the journey, but we're not too far off the start of the journey. So ready impacts are hard to measure.
And we've it is interesting, and I guess the piece that I've, just going back to an earlier point, is around skills, right? If we circle back, right, a
Mm.
lot of this comes down to, do we have the right, we talked about it, it should sit with the CFO, right? As a role,
Hmm.
it makes absolute sense to sit with the CFO. It's around compliance, it's around performance, it's around investment. But what sort of, where's the skills gap here? Have you guys talked to many CFOs? Are they actively looking for sustainability skill sets, or is that
Okay.
something that's not quite got into the mainstream yet?
Um, I think the answer is it's getting to the mainstream, but I
Mm.
think the question becomes twofold. The first is it's easier for large organizations, rather obviously, to have those skill sets. And I've been talking recently to people that have job titles like ESG controller.
Oh, that's
And this will
interesting.
appear in another piece of work that comes down a little bit further down the line. Um, but their role as a finance professional is to look at the whole measurement compliance side of the sustainability journey. They are not the chief sustainability officer, so they are not the strategist delivering, but what they are is a finance professional safeguarding the assets of the organization, measuring the progress, understanding the compliance risks, the reporting requirements, etc. So for the really large entities, yes. When it comes to the mid-tier entities, you've got to find somebody that can actually fulfill quite a lot of those roles. So I think part of it is thinking about upskilling. So is there somebody in your organization? And it's interesting, quite a lot of the ESG controllers that I've spoken to are finance professionals who have chosen to upskill. They are not sustainability professionals coming into finance. It's the other way around. So I think there are lots of upskilling you can do, and you should do. But it's also about understanding the specific risks. And I think this is where you need to start thinking about, well, actually, what expertise do I need to buy in to help me address some of those risks? Because the danger is you end up with a one size fits all, which is the lowest common denominator. And if there are specific risks in your organization, for a sustainability angle, are you really understanding those risks, and do you have the expertise or access to the expertise? And so it's a combination of those two things, I think. Does that make sense, Hannah?
Yeah, it does. And I think the good news is that this is not going to go away. So actually
No.
investing in skills around sustainability is a great long-term piece to look at. And what was really interesting when I was looking again through the pieces, that lower ESD scores tend to be fairly well linked to things like employee happiness and health as well. So,
Mm,
there's an obvious benefit for the organization to invest in it. And so for me, it makes sense for us to start with the people that are going to be monitoring and measuring it, which is finance, right? So
mm.
I think that's a really that I think it's a really interesting piece around, we need to have those skills in finance, and we need to
And,
start thinking strategically about ESG if we aren't already on that journey.
and from a finance perspective, don't wait for the regulatory requirements to hit you,
Mm,
because it increasingly will also be the requirements within your value network of the
yeah,
things that you need to talk about. If you are in the UK and doing business in Europe, you need to be cognizant of what is going on in the EU.
yeah.
If you are thinking about that journey, it's it needs preparation to understand the data. It's the same as where we started the conversation about, the CFO and their massive pile of documents in the bank of, have you done this? Have you thought of that? What is your measurement of this? What is your measurement of that? And it's all data points to collect. But if you are not collecting them on a consistent basis, are you able to tell the narrative? Are you able to explain the risk? Are you able to demonstrate progress? And the progress is what the investor is looking for. So why do things fail? They fail because nobody's making progress. And as I've drawn a diagram in other reports which starts simply at the top of, you need a strategy. From the strategy, you need to measure your performance internally. Then you can report it, which links back to your strategy. If you are not going around that triangle, then you end up with a point of, you potentially are not measuring progress, which is where investment will fail.
Yeah. And I think investors, obviously there's a massive piece on that, but I think like with anything, you can't improve what you don't know, right? And I think that's the piece,
Hmm.
isn't it? If you haven't even got the line in the sand about where you are, if you haven't understood your position, you cannot, one, you cannot communicate it, but also you can't improve it. So that, I think that has to be the first piece for a lot of organizations. Is like, where are you now? Understanding where you are so that then you can assess the risk and decide whether it needs to be prioritized. And depending on where you're at in your acquisition journey or your investment journey, then obviously that will have an
Yep.
impact.
And are you really thinking about the exposures that you have from the nature of the organization that you are on that
Mm,
sustainability journey? Yeah. As I said, if you're in an industry where carbon trading is important, are you, or likely to be important, are you understanding what the impact of that might be? There are draft regulations out there about that. If you are in an industry that is more manufacturing focused, what is happening in your value network? Um, if you're in an industry that that one example, without going into too much detail, but one example of an industry which is basically hospitality centric, where your facilities are, we like to go to coasts.
mm.
If your cities are near coasts, we have issues, as we've seen, with coastal erosion. We have issues with flooding. How robust are your facilities? What is it your customers want? Do they want electric charging points? Is the grid infrastructure good enough to provide that, or is that going to turn your customers away? Because quite often the grid infrastructure, as we know, isn't good enough in rural areas to take the burden at times. So this is a very complex and interrelated set of issues. How you measure progress of that and demonstrate, if you're PE back, let's say in the 5 years that you're there, or even if you are looking to do some kind of raising of funds at some point down the line, are you able to measure credibly that story? And each of those 45 things that we've listed in the checklist, what is your position on those, or those that are relevant to your organization? Because that's about the success of accessing future funding.
So, just to, I guess, because I would genuinely recommend to anyone,
Yeah.
to every CFO listening, read the report. It was a really interesting read, and I did read the full version. There is a shorter, I think, a shorter summary sheet for those that haven't got the time, but it was genuinely interesting. But for those, what's kind of your recommendations, having been through this research, having had those conversations? What are your sort of top tips and takeaways that every CFO
Okay,
should be thinking about right now?
right. Okay. So, um, first thing to do, I think, is back to what we said in the very start of the conversation. What is your strategic intent around sustainability? Does it match whatever you are doing from a transactional point of view? So, what's your strategy? Do you understand the risks and the opportunities? What is your risk appetite around this? So, go into a transaction thinking about where am I today and where do I need to be? So it's sort of your own side of this equation. Secondly, think about the integrated nature of this, because as we say in the report, you can do transactional due diligence in many different forms, but each of those has a sustainability thread somewhere. So understand the impact of these issues and risks across all the elements. So, be that human resource due diligence, be that legal due diligence. I talked about Me Too clauses and warranties. You know, there are so many nuances to this. It's not, do I just do sustainability due diligence? It's sustainability as a risk in all the other forms of due diligence that you need. Think about how it impacts your operating model going forwards, because that is going to be the most fundamental risk in the whole thing. Why do people walk away? It's because that journey of securing the operating model, make it sustainable, is a risk that people aren't willing to take. There isn't the progress. Recognize that it requires constant action investment. So it's agility and be flexible, but recognize that this is a journey you need to work as an organization. So if you are buying another organization, you're integrating two work streams. How are you going to do that? How are you going to keep them integrated? How are you going to deal with emerging threats? Because yeah, the way we see climate change now is probably different than the stories you and I would have told 12 months ago in this conversation. As you said, think about the relevant expertise, both in the finance function to quantify it, but also about experience and expertise in whatever the risks are. So we talked about contaminated land. We talked about the well-being of employees in a value network. What are those risks? Do I really understand them? Do I understand what I'm taking on? Do I understand what I'm asking people to invest in? So whichever way around it is. And finally, out of any of this, in any process, what are the actionable observations? So we've put in a decision tree, which is, in any risk, there's always a decision tree. You either accept or reject. It's not quite as simple as that, is it? But you know what I mean. What is it you are going to do? Because you cannot sit there and just say, okay, tick, I accept the risk. You've got to do something with the risk or the opportunity. And if you are not treating sustainability as an actionable thing going forwards, then you're going to start thinking, well, how do I achieve the return on that investment? And it's the same with any aspect of due diligence. You can't just sit there and say, oh, yes, well, I knew that dot, dot, dot. The equipment in the factory is 10 years old. Well, does it need to be replaced in 5 years? What is the life of that? You start asking those questions. It's the same for a sustainability angle. So think about what is actionable and observationable as you critique whether you sit on the plus or the minus side of that 50% of whether you do the deal or not. So those would be the things I'd say. Think about the things you actually want to do, but don't ignore it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is to raise awareness across the wider exec, isn't there? That this is
Yeah,
something that you have to drive forwards. This isn't just a tick box exercise anymore. It could fundamentally impact your ability to find the right investment and to find the right investment partner as well.
yeah, yeah. And
Mm.
investment partners have their own goals and targets. And as we commented, as the regulators start questioning, well, is this fund really green?
Mm.
They have to justify the extent to which it is as green as they say it is, because those invest in those funds have their own profile. So you've sort of got this, I don't know whether it's a pyramid or a multi-connected world of roles and responsibilities in this.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Clive, for coming on and talking about. As always, I can
That's
pick your brains for hours, but I'm not going to. I promise. And I genuinely enjoyed this conversation. So, for all of our listeners, if you've enjoyed this conversation, perhaps there are some questions you wish I'd ask Clive. Then please do reach out. Would love your feedback, and of course, if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a review. For those of you that would like to read the report, and I strongly recommend you do. I will, we will make sure that the link will be in the show notes so that you can get access to that. And you can download it directly from the ACCA website as well. So, and they're very good, the ACCA. They don't gate things. You don't even have to sacrifice an email address to get access to this great research. Just
Mhm.
literally jump on the website and grab it. So thank you again, Clive, for sharing your knowledge and insight into this topic. It's a really interesting piece. And yeah, please, hoping that you will have some follow-up research on the back of this for us to talk about in the next few months as well.
As always, thank you for inviting me. And yeah, as always, we live in a time of change in the finance world, don't we? And this is just
Mm.
one element of that change. So yeah, there's always more to come.
Absolutely. Your work as a researcher is never done. So, so thank you, Clive. Thank you to our listeners, and we'll see you next time on the CFO 4.0 podcast.